Welcome back. You're watching NewsX World. I'm Rishabh Gulati. From our studios in New Delhi, this is the World Report. Let's have a look at the headlines at this hour. Former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney is the front-runner to succeed Justin Trudeau as the Canadian Prime Minister. The office of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that a delegation will be sent to Doha on Monday to advance ceasefire negotiations. China has announced new tariffs on over $2.6 billion worth of Canadian agricultural and food products after Canada's decision to impose a 100% import duty on Chinese EVs, steel and aluminium. Foreign and defense ministers from Syria, Turkey and Iraq have arrived in Amman. They are meeting their Jordanian counterparts, talks to discuss on security cooperation and regional development. This is the first time such a meeting is taking place in Jordan. The Secret Service has confirmed that they have shot an armed man near the White House in Washington. The incident follows a confrontation on the early hours of Sunday. China, Iran and Russia have announced joint naval exercises in March. The drill, named Security Belt 2025, will take place near Iran's Chabahar port. Reports out of Syria claim more than 1,000 people have been now injured or killed in 2 days of clashes. Syria's leadership has now issued a plea for national unity after fighting led to the deaths of 745 civilians. Russia has announced the capture of another eastern Ukrainian village in the Sumy region. However, the General Staff of Ukraine's military has refused to corroborate this. Our top story: Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who has held office since 2015 in Canada, announced in January that he would be stepping down following intense criticism over domestic policy issues. The Canadian Liberal Party will be announcing its new leader in a short while after, of course, all the issues surrounding the discourse with America are taking place. In the conversation is a former governor of the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney. Many suspect that he is a front runner in the race to become the Prime Minister after Justin Trudeau. There are others up for consideration. There's a larger conversation on American tariffs and, of course, a conversation on when Canada indeed heads for elections, which are due sometime this year. Let's open up this conversation to perspective and information from Terry Miluski. Is joining us. He's the former correspondent of the CBC and an author. He's based out of Ottawa. Mr. Miluski, thank you very much for taking out your time to speak with us. What is your assessment on who is tipped to be the next Prime Minister, sir?
Well, Mark Carney is certainly, according to the pollsters, the front runner. That's partly because of his own personal record, partly also because he's regarded by the Liberals, who will be the only people voting today on the new leadership. They regard him as the most likely to win the next election. Job one for the new leader is not just to take over the leadership and be Prime Minister for a week and be therefore the shortest running Prime Minister in Canadian history. No, the job one is to win the next election, which must happen before October. Liberals are out of time, and so the first order of business will be to see Justin Trudeau step down. He will be replaced as leader. That leader will automatically then become the Prime Minister as the leader of the party with the most seats, and then we're off to the races. And I would assume that there will be an election call either at the end of April, say the 28th, or maybe beginning of May the 5th. After that, we're going to be looking at our watches and saying, hey, you got to call an election soon, so get moving.
All right, elections perhaps in springtime. But what then happens to Justin Trudeau? Do we simply assess that, all right, 10 years in the top job and too much anti-incumbency, too much on his plate, or was he genuinely becoming unpopular for other reasons?
Well, there's no question that he was already extremely unpopular. It's been getting worse and worse and worse. There does seem to be a tendency in Canadian politics, for one reason or another, for prime ministers to basically expire. They wear out their welcome as they get towards 10 years in office. This happened to Prime Minister Harper. It happened to Prime Minister Chrétien. It happened to Prime Minister Mulroney. You can go quite a ways back and find it's pretty hard to break 10 years. After that, the public gets sick of you and they have an opportunity, because they can get rid of a prime minister if they convince enough members of parliament of the ruling party to switch their allegiance. And that's what happened to Trudeau. They said, sorry, we're going to lose our jobs if we run another election with you as leader, so we're going to replace you. And nothing you can do about that.
There is a lot of anger, and I can understand where it comes from, over the rhetoric that is coming from the south of the border. And this seems to be bipartisan. All the political parties, governors, mayors are all sort of speaking in one voice. Has that affected the political climate in Canada? Has the subject changed from the issues of the carbon tax to, inflation, to property prices? Has it all become about standing up to the Americans?
Yes, it's absolutely changed the topic. The Liberals, I was just reading some articles from only a month and a half ago, predicting without a shadow of a doubt that the Liberals were toast in the next election. They were 25 points behind the Conservatives. It was over when Trudeau quit on January 6th. Now, of course, the subject has changed from Trudeau, we're tired of him. The subject is now Trump, we're angry at him. Who's going to be the best leader to stand up to Trump? So the whole topic of the election has changed drastically, and what people are looking for now in the Liberal Party and elsewhere, apparently, according to the polls, is the best person to stand up to Trump and to fight him, go toe-to-toe with Trump, and to make sure that Canada's interests are defended in this trade war.
So how's this changing? Because the latest polls say that there is been a 10-point improvement for the Liberals, where they were languishing in the teens or early 20s. They have approval rating of 30. In most likely to win, the Conservatives are at 40. So there's only a 10-point difference. So where does this put Pierre Poilievre?
Well, it puts him in a bind, because in terms of the international problem, the problem with the big bully down south, is that he can't do anything else but support the government. I mean, if he were to not support the government in this, that would be treachery, that would be an outrage. So there's very little room for him to differentiate himself from the Liberals, and it completely alters the contest for him as much as for anyone. Obviously, it alters it for Mark Carney if he becomes the new Liberal leader. But it's completely different now for Poilievre. The question, the ballot question, if you like, in Canada is going to be, who do you trust to go up against Trump? Is it going to be Mark Carney, international man of mystery, a master of economics, governor of the Bank of England and of Canada, spent 15, 16, 17 years at the top levels of global finance, or this career politician, Mr. Poilievre, who has been sailing along on what seem to be three-word slogans, according to the Liberals, like axe the tax, which is a reference to the carbon tax. Well, guess what? Mark Carney, since he ended his term of office as the governor of the Bank of England, became the UN Special Envoy for climate action, to try to yoke international finance to continuing to take global action on climate change. So there's another issue upon which the two will be divided as they go into the election, and it's by no means clear that Poilievre is not going to keep losing support in the polls as he has been over the past couple of weeks since this trade war erupted.
All right. We had the privilege of hosting former Prime Minister Stephen Harper just a few days ago, and when what he said on record was also very strong on what was happening in America and the positions which some can argue, sir, that they are rhetorical positions, that in the end, these are diplomatic sort of negotiating stances being taken, and the Trump administration is known to be high on rhetoric, but when it comes to substance, things will settle down in a few weeks. If they do, does it come back to inflation and other domestic issues, or is this going to be the frontline issue in the elections as you see it?
I think that even if at this point, even if the Trump administration declares that, okay, the waffling is over now, it's been off again, there's a pause, there's not a pause, even if they now declare that this time for real we're going to go through with it, I'm not sure people would entirely believe it until they see it. And if they say that they're going to stop it and they're going to end the trade war, people won't believe that either, because he said that before too. So it seems to me that this is likely to be a continuing issue throughout the year, and sometime in the course of this year, there has to be a federal election. So I don't think this is going to disappear as an issue, even if Trump says it must. I don't think he would go that far anyway. He's going to impose some tariffs. It may be well watered down, but he's going to impose some tariffs, and even if it's for no other reason other than to save his face. So I don't think this is going to disappear as an issue, and that helps the liberals, hurts the conservatives.
All right. Terry Milewski, thank you very much for joining us with your thoughts. Let's shift focus, ladies and gentlemen, to the conversation that we've been having on our second top story, because as we've been discussing developments in Canada and what Mike Carney has been saying in terms of his position on these issues, dramatic developments are also taking place in Israel, where we are now being told that US President Donald Trump's envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, is expected to be arriving in Doha coming Tuesday for ceasefire negotiations. These would be the first Gaza ceasefire negotiations since President Trump took office. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office on Saturday also announced that Israel will be sending a delegation to Doha coming on Monday. According to that statement, a delegation, they said, will, quote, make an effort to advance negotiations on the fragile ceasefire in Gaza, unquote. Meanwhile, several meetings between Hamas leaders and US hostage negotiators have been taking place. Israel's Strategic Affairs Minister has lashed out at these developments on Friday after Israel learnt of an unprecedented meeting that was held with a Hamas delegation. Let me open up this conversation. Joining us on the broadcast for a perspective, Rohan Gunaratne is with us. He is based out of Singapore. Mr. Gunaratne, now let's put this in perspective. There were ceasefire negotiations, quote unquote hostage negotiations that took place in January. Have they been reasonably successful that we can expect something to happen in Doha?
Absolutely. It is because Hamas has released only 50% of the hostages it is currently holding. The other hostages Hamas do not wish to release unless there is a permanent ceasefire. So Hamas is determined to keep them until there is an internationally recognized arrangement. Israel believes that Hamas should not govern Gaza. Israel's strategic calculus is to disarm Hamas and dismantle its military and governance capabilities. So the talks in Doha are very important because both Hamas and Israel have different aims and objectives. Hamas wants to survive, wants to sustain, wants to govern, continue to govern Gaza. Israel wants to dismantle the Hamas infrastructure because it is a direct threat to the future security and stability of Israel. The Americans are working very hard with the Qataris, with the Egyptians, and with a number of other countries to ensure that there is continuity of the ceasefire, because otherwise more Palestinians will die, because Hamas is using the human shield to protect itself. And in the counter-terrorism operations mounted by IDF, a number of Palestinian civilians have died.
Yes.
So there is a huge commitment now to move forward to a more permanent ceasefire from the temporary ceasefire that we all witnessed in phase one.
All right. Mr. Gunaratne, in your assessment, has the state of Israel achieved some tactical or strategic goals through the course of this war?
The state of Israel has built what you call deterrence because Israeli security is based on deterrence. Israel faced a seven-front war. Israel has deterred Iran by targeting its air defense systems. Israel has decapitated the Lebanese Hezbollah leadership. Israeli operations led to regime change in Syria. Israeli operations have demonstrated to the Houthis or the Ansarullah organization in Yemen that it will strike relentlessly against the Houthi infrastructure. So in many ways, Israel has restored its capacity for deterrence by demonstrating it's able to conduct targeted operations.
Mr. Gunaratne, how would you rate the possibility of any successful negotiation taking place in Doha at this point of time?
You have asked the most toughest question. That is because the objectives of Israel and the objectives of Hamas are different. It is very difficult for there to be a permanent ceasefire. Perhaps there can be a temporary ceasefire because Israel's main aim is to commence the war and dismantle Hamas. But the Hamas objective is to retain hostages as long as they can because their survival is guaranteed by not releasing all the hostages.
Where do you expect, Mr. Gunaratne, the future of the other Arab states in either a negotiated settlement or indeed the rebuilding of Gaza once this hostile war ends?
Egypt has come up with an Arab League plan to rebuild Gaza, but there is no support from Israel or from the United States. These are the two main players. If they don't agree, no Arab proposal by any other state will work. So there needs to be greater dialogue, greater consultation if there is going to be permanent peace. But the way things are going, the way Hamas celebrated when they released these hostages, they made a big show of it. Israel is very clear that Israel wants to dismantle Hamas, and that will happen. Israel and the United States will also work together to dismantle Iran's nuclear program. In fact, they have been conducting exercises, and President Trump has already threatened Iran. Of course, Iran has said that Iran will not negotiate with the United States. So in the coming weeks, you will see America taking a very tough position against Iran, that is backing these 6 groups that have been targeting Israel.
Mr. Gunaratne, then who speaks for the Gazans or the Palestinians in any table that is negotiating a truce or a ceasefire on Gaza?
Currently, the Arab countries have been very good to the Gazan people. They have resisted President Trump's plan to evacuate the Gazans to Jordan and to Egypt and elsewhere. But at the same time, none of these Arab countries like Hamas, because Hamas is a terrorist group. They saw the brutal terrorist attack Hamas mounted October 7th, 2023. They themselves do not want Hamas. If you talk to them privately, they detest Hamas. But the Arab street, the Muslim street is such that those Arab rulers, those Muslim rulers have to pander to the radical segments of the Muslim community, which is also very small but very vocal. So my personal view is that eventually Hamas will be eliminated, but the Gazans will remain, and of course a number of Gazans will die. So it is for the Arab leaders now to come up with a solution that the United States and Israel will agree to.
All right, before I let you go, sir, how are other global developments? We are in a world of trade and tariff conversations which are turning hostile across the world for many reasons. There are separate meetings going on as we speak in Saudi Arabia regarding what is taking place in Ukraine. In the larger context, how much diplomatic capital, energy, heft do you think can be put in solving this in the near term?
The Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans, and the Iranians, they are all very keen to resolve this problem. And I believe that there will be, other than the Arab countries, other than Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Jordan, all these countries, there will be a significant amount of interest and pressure from the major powers and also powers like Iran to resolve this, because next time Israel attacks, it's going to dismantle the Iranian nuclear capabilities, and they will not only attack those capabilities, they will also attack Iran's economic infrastructure. So what is important for us to understand is it's best that these conflicts are peacefully resolved through dialogue and discussion. But if there is no genuine willingness on the part of the leaders, certainly we will see another phase of war.
All right. Rohan Gururatne joining us from Singapore. Thank you for being with us on NewsX World. Let's shift focus. China has now hit back with counter tariffs at Canada on $2.6 billion worth of agricultural and food products. The move comes after Canada imposed levies on Chinese electric vehicles, steel and aluminium a few months ago. These new tariffs will now take effect on the 20th of March. Beijing's response includes a 100% tariff on more than $1 billion of Canadian rapeseed oil and peas. There is also a 25% tariff on pork and aquatic products. China's Commerce Ministry has accused the Canadian administration of breaking WTO rules and practicing protectionism. This latest development adds even more tension to the global trade and tariffs war, which are going on not only in North America but across the world, with US President Donald Trump threatening tariffs and pausing some of them in trade negotiations taking place not only with the Canadians but with other countries across the world as well. So how is this fitting into the larger conversation? Let's pick up that conversation. Ross Feingold is joining us from Taipei. Mr. Feingold, thanks very much for taking out the time for joining us on NewsX World. Let me come to the specific of what has happened. Now, reciprocal tariffs on Canadian products, is this predating the current tariff war conversation, or should it be situated right in the middle of it?
It predates in many ways, because Canada imposed these tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, steel and aluminum about 5 months ago. So it was before President Trump took office and ushered in a round of tariffs on Canadian, Mexican, and Chinese goods, and potentially other countries' goods as well. And I think part of China's anger at Canada over this is that they perceive Canada, at least prior to Trump taking office, when Biden was still the president, they perceive Canada to acting in concert with the United States when it comes to taking actions against China, whether that's trade-related actions or criticizing China's human rights records, or other thing, or doing or saying other things that China dislikes. So one of the things that really annoys China is their perception that Canada doesn't have its own policy with regard to China, but it basically follows along with the United States.
Would that continue in the given climate where, on the rhetoric part at least, it has been very hostile in North America right now?
It's difficult to say because of the instability in Canadian politics at the moment. There's going to be a new Liberal Party leader, and then sometime between now and October, but probably sooner rather than later, there's going to be an election, and we don't know who's going to win that election because the polling has become closer, and it could be the Liberals, it could be the Conservatives. So much of this process is unknown. Perhaps Canada won't impose additional tariffs on China, and perhaps they would do that out of fear of retaliatory tariffs on Canadian goods from China. So maybe Prime Minister Trudeau and whoever replaces him in the coming days will leave it as is. And maybe because of the unpleasantness in the Canada-US relationship at the moment, in the coming months, Canada won't look to follow additional tariffs that the United States imposes on China. But again, so much of this trilateral relationship, including in the trade space, is unknown at the moment.
Mr. Feingold, many of the European countries, Canada, the United States, India, large economies, they all run a trade deficit to China. In this regard, is the tariff conversation that is going on globally, and I say conversation in quotes, it's becoming a lot more difficult than that. Is that conversation primarily directed at China and we've gotten distracted with the other tariff wars? In the end, is it going to all boil down to China?
Certainly, countries in Europe or India and other places around the world, most notably the United States, they look very closely at their trade imbalance with China, and they see that their country has a very large deficit with China, that they buy a lot more from China than China purchases from their own countries, and they're looking to address this. President Trump certainly tried to address this in his first term with tariffs starting from 2018. Then he negotiated what's called the Phase 1 trade agreement with China, which was signed in January of 2020, but shortly thereafter, the COVID-19 pandemic spread around the world, and China really never reached the goals of the Phase 1 agreement to purchase American products, most notably agriculture products. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that these concerns about China's large trade surpluses really predates the ongoing trade discussions, to put it lightly, or the trade wars, to be more specific, that are now ongoing after President Trump took office this past January.
Were the previous set of tariff escalations reasonably successful? How do we assess them a few years later? Because many people are suggesting that if EVs, for example, China simply shifted its exports to Mexico and EVs imported from Mexico into the US then started increasing at 40% per year. So are there too many loopholes available for tariffs to really be a successful way of negotiating this?
Certainly, Chinese manufacturers have been very adept at moving part of their manufacturing to places like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Mexico to avoid ever increasing tariffs on goods made in China. But the United States and other governments are catching up to that. And if necessary, they're going to impose higher tariffs on places like Mexico and Vietnam, not only because there's Chinese manufacturing or Chinese-owned manufacturing in those countries, but also because those countries originally enjoyed a trade surplus with the United States anyway. And President Trump, whether friend or unfriendly country, he's looking to impose higher tariffs on any country that has a trade imbalance with the United States. And he's talked about doing this on April 2nd or after April 2nd, when a report is due from his team about trade imbalances and trade barriers around the world. And I think we have to take President Trump very seriously. Now, the interesting part about all of this discussion is, in every country, there's always going to be an industry that says, well, maybe we shouldn't impose higher tariffs because China is going to retaliate against my industry, and my industry makes a lot of money exporting to China. In the United States, that's the agriculture industry. In Canada, that's the agriculture and some other industries. In Germany, for example, that's the auto industry. So there's certainly always going to be some voices that say, let's not get into a trade war with China. But it might be a losing argument in the near term when governments are increasingly set on raising tariffs on made in China goods.
So would the trade wars, which like it or not have already started in terms of rhetoric, I would say in terms of practice as well, that are taking place within North America, within the United States and Mexico, United States and Europe, United States and India, are these more likely to get resolved reasonably so that the conversation focuses once again on the trade deficit with China? Or do you think these will overshadow and the really large trade deficits with China will be forgotten in the midst?
Well, President Trump is not going to forget the large trade imbalance with China. He's going to make that a priority in any trade policy decisions that the Trump administration makes. Another interesting thing here is that President Trump clearly prefers bilateral negotiation. He doesn't really enjoy multilateral discussions or multilateral organizations or even multilateral meetings like the G7 or US-EU bilateral meetings. He's just not a fan of multilateral organizations or multilateral meetings. He really prefers the bilateral approach, maybe because he believes that he's an excellent negotiator. Maybe it's because he dislikes certain countries and doesn't want them in the room. But he clearly prefers bilateral approaches, which He'll do to some extent with Mexico, Canada, and maybe even China if he visits China in the coming months, as he said he would like to do. It's a bit more difficult when negotiating with the EU because it's so many countries, and they're speaking as typically when they're dealing with the United States on trade issues, they're representing the entire bloc. And it would be very difficult for President Trump to have bilateral trade negotiations with specific EU members. He really has to deal with the entire bloc.
Before I let you go, Ross Feingold, is it a likelihood, coming back to our original question on Canada, that given what has taken place in just the past few days and the very high levels of rhetoric, and to the point that all the mayors and the governors and bipartisan conversations are taking place, which is with the premise that we must stand up to American bullying, quote unquote, is it possible, therefore, that Canadian policy on China becomes a bit more relaxed with the premise that we have to deal with America first?
Well, again, that's going to be up to the next leader of Canada. It's not going to be up to Prime Minister Trudeau, who's literally in his last days as the Prime Minister. But again, there's also going to be a lot of pressure from Canadian industry saying this is destroying our exports, this is destroying our jobs, and the next Canadian Prime Minister is going to have to be very sensitive to that, and they might want to avoid letting their trade battle with China spiral into a broader war, because it will hurt Canadian exports and Canadian jobs. And also, I think the next Prime Minister, whoever it is, and whoever is the Prime Minister after the upcoming Canadian election, they're not going to want to be seen as a little brother of the United States when making a China policy. They're going to look to have their own China policy.
Fair enough. Ross Feingold, thank you very much for putting all these developments in perspective. Ross Feingold joining us from Taipei. Thank you very much for watching this conversation. We take a short break. News and updates continue on NewsX World on the other side.